Okay. Yeah, just from the get-go, I'd just like to acknowledge the co-funding that DOT contributed to this. They kind of initiated a project that aligned really well with their work, and yeah, I think it's made a much better, much stronger study. Okay, warm forests, beech mast, and climate change. Okay, so why are we interested in this? So obviously, climate's a major driver of seeding. You know, we've already seen that in some of the previous talks. Seeding drives rodent eruptions. And so there's this potential for major changes to ecosystem dynamics under climate change. And if we've got some sort of forewarning of that, maybe we can start thinking about how we might manage that, maybe even, you know, experimentally manipulating stuff to develop better strategies. So the more we know now, the better position we'll be when those changes really kick in. So what have we observed to date in New Zealand? Well, it's a little bit all over the place, actually. So when we start looking at beech, we've only really got one really long-term beech seedfall data set in New Zealand that's suitable for this. And this is the Craigieburn study that Rob Allen and his lab has worked with over the years. And what they've found is that at high elevation for beech, there tends to be this increase in intermediate years. But not in the really high years, and this isn't observed at any of the other elevations. I had a chat with Sarah Richardson actually just the other day, though, and she reckons in some of the more recent data post this study, they are starting to see those peaks kind of creeping up as well. So we're already seeing that change. A study that's been mentioned a number of times already is Oscar's study on tawa and Te Urewera, where Tuhoi have observed declining tawa seedfall over time. And this was explained by rising winter and summer temperatures driving down seedfall, so that now, you know, the places in New Zealand where tawa seedfall is the highest is actually at its southern limit down in Blue Duck Reserve. I've been doing a bit of work on Kainaklau snow tussocks. This is another really long-term data set, and we can't find any trend at all in Kainaklau. But then we also can't find much of a trend in summer temperatures either. So it's perhaps not surprising. So a real mixed bag in terms of what we're seeing in terms of the effects of climate on seeding in New Zealand. What do the modelers predict? Well, there haven't been that many studies, but this one by Holland in 2015, they compared two different kind of theoretical models for what might be driving seedfall. The delta T one, which a lot of you will be familiar with, found minimal impact on seeding, and this is because, you know, that temperature. Summer temperature in last year minus summer temperature the year before, you know, it's a relative measure. So if there's an overall increase in the mean temperature, that's kind of going to get factored out in that subtraction. But the other model they tested was a T1 model. So just warm summers in the previous year driving seeding. And they had this rather alarming prediction that 83 to 89% of years will be mast years for hard beech in the Orongorongo Valley. And that compares with kind of 19% currently. So that's a slightly scary statistic. But then what happens if you add in resource limitation? And so there's a little bit of theoretical work on this. This study was in Kainaklau, where seeding last year means that you've got less resource to seed this year. And so that could lead to more regular seeding, but perhaps smaller seed crops. So there's a big range of different things as to how climate could result in changes in seeding in New Zealand. So given all these different kind of models, you know, if we're actually going to predict out in the future, and also the fact that, you know, the findings tend to be so sensitive, well, what model should we actually use, you know? And I guess the best answer to that is, I guess, the model that fits the best, you know, or a range of models, you know, as Holland has done. So we started off kind of comparing an additive model, so that's summer temperature and in the previous year, that's T1, plus summer temperature the year before that. And that summer temperature in the year before that, T2, that indicates whether it was a seeding year last year, and so if it seeded last year, then it means there's less resources to seed this year. So there's all these complicated lags and stuff that's kind of underlying all of these models. Then there's a difference model, which I've already explained, delta T, and then a third model, which we've used on Kainaklau, which is T1 plus T2, and then an interaction between the two. And that's kind of trying to better capture that idea that, you know, whether you seed in the current year depends on whether A, you got the cue to seed last year, which is a T1, and you didn't seed last year, which is indicated by T2. So we fitted these models. We included a couple of other things in here as well. So the data that I used, we also had some measurements of DBHs of the largest tree, because large trees contribute disproportionately to the amount of seeding that you tend to get. And also spring rain. So in my earlier talk today, I kind of talked about that if you get rain around the time of pollination, because it kind of glops up all the pollen, you tend to get less effective pollination and therefore fewer seeds. And what do we find? Well, it turns out that that interaction model out of all of these was probably the best performing. So mountain beech, red beech, it was a clear winner. In terms of silver beech, it was kind of equal between the additive model and the interaction model. And delta T always performed worse by quite some considerable margin. So one of the things I wanted to look at really here is whether we could get a more realistic model. Because one of the problems with these models that we kind of work with all the time is that they have what's known as a log link function, which means, as I mentioned earlier, that kind of the relationship between climate and seeding is exponential. Now, this is kind of important when it comes to predicting seedfall under future climates, because if you've got a warming climate, then that maximum seedfall that you can get is potentially exponentialized. And so you're likely to get these massive increases, which may not be realistic. You know, like we don't expect that trees can keep producing seeds like higher and higher and higher. You know, there is a limit to how much they can do. So I set about sort of trying to see if, well, what about an alternative? What about if the temperature Q had this sigmoidal function, and that you get to a point where the curve starts leveling off, you know? And you can imagine that that could arise in a situation where you've got, for example, resource limitation, you know, like as I said before, they just can't keep producing more and more seeds. You have to remember that, you know, sexual reproduction via producing seeds is only one mode of reproduction that a tree is using. It also has to manage to grow as well, because it's constantly competing with other trees around it. So if it puts everything into producing seeds, then it's going to lose out in the growth states and then ultimately be overtopped. And so its lifetime reproduction might actually be less. So we took this model and we ended up fitting it to our red beech data set, silver beech, and also mountain beech. And it turned out that actually it was quite a good fit. So we had to use Bayes. The good old Reverend Bayes kind of helped us with this. And that expected log pointwise predictive density thing, is you can interpret that a little bit like AIC. And so this model was quite well supported with, you know, reasonable R-squareds, you know, it's okay. So we took this model and we thought, okay, we're going to simulate this under future climates. And what will that look like? So we used the downscaled climate predictions on the VCSM grid that have been produced by Whenua. As our reference point, we used the 1995 baseline data. And we looked at this for 2 climate change scenarios. So I know all the numbers have kind of changed now with the latest scenarios and stuff, but at the time, and probably still currently actually, these are the only ones that we have those kind of downscaled predictors for. So we looked at kind of a middle of the road scenario, RCP 4.5, and then a real extreme one, which is the RCP 8.5. And we projected this out until 2040 and also 2090. And the results I'm going to show you here are restricted to the EcoSat pure beech and mixed beech forest classes. So there's a couple of metrics that I'm going to focus on here. One is we're looking at whether, there in the future there is a higher baseline shift, so an increase in that median. And this would be kind of similar to what's being observed in Craigieburn at high elevation, where you've got an increase in that kind of intermediate years. So what this means is that, if you have a higher median, there might always be some seeds in the system, and those some seeds might be enough to maintain rodent populations all year round. And then you'll have massive outbreaks when there actually is a proper big mast. And the other thing we looked at was, whether the peaks get high. You might have a situation where the median stays about the same, but actually when it does mast, it really goes for it. And so this is measured by this increase in the 90th percentile. So we're looking at really extreme events. And then the other thing I looked at was the increase in the proportion of big years. So compared to that kind of baseline 1995 period, how many more of the years predicted under these scenarios will be bigger than a big year back then? So first one I'm going to show you here is for RCP 4.5. So that's kind of the intermediate scenario. Looking at the baseline, that median value, as you can see, there's some small increases in some areas, but we're not actually predicting a huge change in that. Maybe there might be like another 100 seeds or something in some areas, but generally, it's pretty mellow under that scenario. So where are we now? Oh. There we go. Okay, now looking at peak seedful. That's where we start seeing some changes. So what this is saying is that those areas in the bright red, that's where we're going to see bigger peaks. So while the median doesn't change that much when it does mast, we're predicting that the peaks are going to get bigger. The other thing you've noticed about this is that it tends to be mostly down the eastern side and also in the North Island, particularly in that area around Taranaki and out towards East Cape. This is something that was kind of consistent over all of this, and I think it's mostly because, with the increase in westerlies and whatnot that are expected under climate change, you're getting a lot more warming in the east from the firn winds, and that's triggering these expected bigger seedfall events. And then we go to the more extreme scenario. Again, by 2040, the median's kind of starting to get up. By 2090, we're beginning to predict that baseline is going to get quite substantial. That we could have, rats in the system every year that we didn't usually have before. And particularly you can see there the area around kind of Buller, Nelson area, maybe through to North Canterbury and stuff. There's a bit more colouring in there than what there was previous and compared to the 4.5 scenario. It's not working very well. So my slide changing is going a bit dud. When we look at the peak seedfall, again, it's a similar sort of scenario to what we see under RCP 4.5. It's like, well, the peaks are going to be big. They probably can't get that much bigger, again, that pattern of down the East and South Island and throughout the North Island. Now, what is this? Oh, proportion of big years. Yep, forgot about that one. So if we look at this, we can see those kind of patterns in terms of the increases in the maximum seedfall kind of starting to come through here. And that, by 2090 especially, but also by 2040, particularly under RCP 8.5, we are beginning to see where there is a much higher proportion of big years happening every year, to the point where, under the most extreme scenario in 2090, some of those East and South Island areas and Nelson Buller kind of areas could be seeing really large events all the time under this particular model. Now, we've yet to kind of dive deep and look at elevation gradients and all of that, but it's kind of on the radar for So you'll see that when this work actually comes out. So how does our results kind of compare to what Holland, for example, has found? So they found for beech in the Whenua Valley, 19% of years are currently mast events. Delta T, as I said before, 21 to 23% would be mast events under climate change, and then 83 to 89% from 2001 to 2100. Our results show Whenua Valley 30% of big seed years by 2040, 50% by 2090. So they're not quite as extreme as what the Holland results are predicting under the T1 model, which is kind of what you'd expect, you know, given that we used a sigmoid curve. But nonetheless, you know, the predictions are fairly dire anyway. You know, it's like, well, is that happening all the time, or is that happening half the time? You know, it's going to be, it will be pretty rough if those predictions come to pass. Under 4.5, you know, we're up to sort of 70% of years by 2090 being big years in Nelson Buller, and under 8.5, 80 to 90% by 2090. So the model is predicting some quite big changes in how those systems operate. But, you know, there's always some caveats, you know, like this sort of modeling, you know, there's a lot of kind of crystal ball gazing going on here. You know, we fit models to data that has a current range and, you know, particular climatic attributes. And then because the climate change scenario is completely new, you know, we haven't got there yet, you're always predicting beyond where we're comfortable with. So I think we have to have that in the back of our mind, you know, that there's always this nagging doubt that, you know, maybe it's not actually going to be quite as extreme as that, because, you know, we're going into unknown territory. And the other thing I think that's potentially important here, and we really have no idea on this, but I think it could be huge, and that's the idea of acclimation. So although these temperatures might be warming up and we're going to get, you know, potentially could get more seeding and whatnot, certainly the queue to seed will be warmer. The fact is they might not seed like that just because of acclimation. You know, they have enough plasticity in the way that they respond to their environment that they won't just go gangbusters. You know, they know that it's not smart, or no, you know, I mean, anthropomorphizing, but you know, that they know that it's not smart because, you know, as I said before, you put all those resources into producing seed, you can't grow, you know. And so I guess the case I put for that is that, you know, in the South Island, we've got these 900+ meter forest elevation gradients. You know, the lapse rate for that is 0.6 degrees C per 100 meters, you know. So you're looking at, you know, over 5 degrees centigrade difference between, you know, the highest and the lowest elevations. And yet, you know, we don't see these crazy seedfall events that the models predict. You know, we still have this kind of widespread spatial synchrony where every 3 or 4 years, you know, you get a mast year all over the place, and in between you get nothing. So I think, you know, there really is the potential that the plants can acclimate, and that, you know, it won't be the disaster that we think that it's going to be. And I think that might be me. Thank you.
Okay, there's a couple of, can you hear me, Adrian?
Yep.
Yep. Okay, there's a couple of questions turned up while you were talking, and we can squeeze one of them in. So Cara says, Adrian, as climate changes, any idea how quickly we should be rethinking the tree species we use for restoration projects? Already seeing influence of survival in places like Auckland.
I don't know whether I'm the best person to answer that. I mean, certainly something like survival, you know, like drought is predicted to be kind of a big one in some areas, and so obviously we're going to have to start kind of rethinking that sort of thing. In terms of what it means kind of for future seeding dynamics and whatnot, you know, and availability of seed and food and what impact that might have on pests and whatnot, I think the jury is still out, just in terms of how it's going to affect some of the more diverse species out there, you know, looking beyond beech. You know, my earlier talk today, I showed, well, I hope I showed how difficult it is actually to model seedfall in some of these species. And without that kind of knowledge, tawa looks like climate change is going to be bad for seed pool, so we can't automatically assume that there's going to be more seed from doing this. So I don't think we quite have enough knowledge there yet to predict that.
Okay, thanks, Adrian. We're spot on time, so we'll get on with the next one.